Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to AJ117, Introduction to Terrorism and Homeland Security. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So, this week's lecture is going to cover Chapter 13, where we are going to take a closer look at emergency management. So, as with other chapters, quite a bit of content to cover. So, with that said, let's just jump right into our weekly lecture. Historically, disaster relief has suffered from several major issues. The movement towards relief generally was regarded by early American beliefs that were commonly held in colonial times and beyond, and individualism, self-reliance, and the tenets of the Protestant ethic, meaning people should work hard, have self-discipline, and be thrifty with what they have earned, produced and greatly impacted the overall idea of giving aid to others, even during times of an emergency. And many people thought that any kind of aid, even in limited quantities, would make people sort of dependent and was therefore considered to be counterproductive. Now, for nearly 130 years, the federal government insisted that local government was the appropriate responder to disasters, but it gave the government little or really no assistance. And once established, civil defense had substantial value to the federal government, primarily because one of its missions was supporting and protecting the country from foreign enemies by mobilizing public support. However, civil defense had really little regard for providing any type of aid or relief. And as it emerged, emergency management did not really speak the same language. The definitions of terms and concepts varied widely from one state to another, as well from one community to another. And we've seen that with definitions. And until emergency management achieved some standardization of language, approaches, equipment, and capabilities, it really had difficulty communicating and operating in kind of a multi-agency environment, which often caused confusion during these types of major responses. So what we're going to look at in this chapter are basically how these and other related issues changed over time. And we're going to take a look at also the newer version of emergency management practices that are now at the forefront of both disaster mitigation and also hazard mitigation. So that's kind of where we're going to go with this chapter. So what then are some of the goals of emergency management? And yes, EM is another abbreviation, right? So emergency management, or EM, is the managerial function that creates the framework within which communities reduce their vulnerability to hazards and cope with incidents and disasters. Now, the goals of emergency management are: 1, to save lives; 2, to prevent injuries; and 3, to protect property and the environment. And really, all communities face a variety of threats or hazards which endanger property, people, and also other assets. And when you talk, when you're talking about major incidents outside of the realm of terrorism, it may even be geographic, right? Because some areas are more prone, areas that it snows, where you might have, avalanches or different things like that. Some areas are prone to flooding. Some areas are prone to fires. So there's also some geographic kind of issues that seep into this. But again, all communities face a variety of different types of threats or hazards. So what are these categories then of threats or hazards? Well, they're kind of pushed into three categories, and there's subcategories and subcategories, but we're going to look at this as three broad categories, if you will, of threats or hazards. And the first will be natural, which includes weather conditions as well as animal and human diseases. And these threats or hazards are relatively well understood because we learn about many of them from weather and news reports. And examples could include things like tornadoes, hurricanes, even mad cow disease and Ebola. In late 2014, there were several cases of Ebola virus disease in the United States, creating fears of a possible epidemic. So, this is one category of threat or hazards. The second would be technological or accidental. And these would be created by, one, technological failures, such as a collapsed building or a failed dam that caused flooding. Or two would be accidents, such as the unintended release of, let's say, hazardous materials into the environment. So these are technological and accidental. And then the third would be terrorist and or human. And these arise from intentional acts intended to disrupt systems, destroy property, and even kill people. And to illustrate, sarin is a nerve agent. Loosely, it's a poisonous gas that acts quickly and causes the nervous system not to function properly. In 1995, 5 two-man teams entered the Tokyo subway system and actually released sarin gas. The attackers from the Shirinko group quickly took an antidote and they fled. And 12 people were killed and 5,500 injured. And it was the first instance of a terrorist group using chemical warfare. So except for a mistake by the group in making the sarin and not using a more effective way of distributing it, fatalities would have been and should have been much higher. So again, terrorist and human, these are things that arise from intentional acts that are intended to disrupt systems, destroy property, and or kill individuals. And I have a larger list here. You can also find this chart in your textbook on page 356 towards the bottom. But it breaks it out for us, giving us a kind of a wider list of things to look at. So you have natural, it can be avalanche, drought, earthquake, flood, natural things, volcanic eruption. Then you have the technological or accidental, which could be a bridge failure, dam failure, hazardous materials, a mine accident, a train derailment, etc. And then you have the ones that are caused. So you have terrorist or human caused, biological, chemical, cyber explosion, nuclear, radiological, and then sabotage. So there's a kind of a broader list for you as well. So there are many ways to gauge the severity of some of these incidents that we've been talking about. And examples of these measures include the number of deaths and injuries, people displaced and evacuated, homes and businesses that have major damage or that are destroyed, and finally financial indicators such as dollar loss and assistance expenditures. And these are examples, some of the ways to gauge the severity of an incident. So when you kind of look at it, there's a continuum here, and it's actually pretty easy to look at. The severity continuum is kind of a quick front-end tool that allows officials to quickly gauge how hard did we really get hit, meaning where did this incident occur? Was it, on the low end of the spectrum, an emergency, a disaster, a catastrophe, or what we call an extinction level event? And I'll talk about those in a minute, but this is the severity continuum. So a little bit more in contrast to what we've been talking about, this severity continuum again is a kind of a quick tool that allows us to roughly gauge the preliminary answer to the question, how hard did this impact us? And the threats or hazards listed under terrorism or human in that area caused are the means. And the targets or setting at which they are directed may be civilians walking in a congested area, a department store, a sporting event, schools, government buildings, national monuments, resorts, churches, mass transit, and similar entities. So again, the threats or hazards listed under terrorism human caused are actually the means. So when you go back to that, the means would be biological or chemical or cyber. So that's the means in which it was done. Does that kind of make sense? So hopefully that makes sense. Because here, these are all natural things that happen. These are like tech or accidental. But when the terrorist ones, these are also the means. It's the list, but it's also the means in which it was carried out, how it was caused, right? It was caused by biological. It was caused by chemical. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get the point across there. So let's look at these different conditions, okay, along that severity continuum. So again, emergency, disaster, catastrophe, or extinction level. So the first one, an emergency. An emergency is a condition of actual danger to the lives and safety of property that requires a response. And emergencies ordinarily are handled locally. Local law enforcement, local fire, etc. Of course, unless it involves federal property, then you would also have a federal response. So one example of a locally handled disaster would be a small city in which floodwaters crossed a section of a road and washed the road away. So locally, the city would respond with public works, etc., and they would rebuild that part of the road at its own expense. And some cities are self-insured, etc. And when you get into these larger major disasters, you can apply for federal aid. But again, we're kind of talking at the lowest level, an emergency. Next would be what we call a disaster. And a disaster is more severe than an emergency because it causes a serious disruption of the functioning of an entity, such as a community, and it produces widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses that exceed the ability of just a community to cope with it with its own resources. So it's too big for the little community or the community to deal with, right? Does that make sense? So for example, hospitals may have been severely damaged by tornadoes. Clean drinking water cannot be provided. Temporary housing for displaced person is inadequate. Power has been knocked out. There are pockets of looting. Food supplies are urgently needed to be, to feed people and to be replaced. And few businesses have any type of continuity of operations, meaning they really can't operate. So there's so many little things that are happening from this one incident that city or county or even state, depending upon the significance of the disaster, it can't handle it. So it's going to need assistance from outside. So it needs more resources other than just their own. And I kind of threw in a couple of things, whether it's an earthquake, a volcano, a tornado, a hurricane, etc. And some of these are will actually move up into the catastrophe range. So part of, as we look at the severity continuum, one thing to keep in mind is something called mutual aid. And this typically happens at the disaster level. Sometimes it can happen at the catastrophe, but usually that's too big. So at the more local level, as a community uses its own resources to respond to a disaster, assistance from other, say, cities around you or counties around you is going to become essential. So there's something called a mutual aid agreement. And this allows neighboring local governments and even state and federal assistance as needed after a disaster. So federal assistance is intended to be a supplement, not a substitute. So if you get assistance from the federal government, it's kind of a supplement to help you get through the disaster. It's not a complete substitute. But again, to define mutual aid is basically, these are agreements between surrounding cities, agencies, organizations, or jurisdictions to provide a mechanism to quickly obtain assistance in the form of, let's say, personnel, equipment, materials, or other types of services. And it's typically rapid and short term. So, if you can't handle it on your own with your own resources, you can call upon cities outside to come in and help you. And that happens a lot of times with fires, right? Where if the fire's too big and it's out of the scope of the city to handle, they'll call in other fire departments to help. And then when the fire's out, those other agencies leave. That's a mutual aid agreement. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And next is what we call a catastrophe. And a catastrophe is an incident that directly or indirectly affects a large portion or all of a country and requires national and sometimes international responses. So in the previous chapter, you saw the photo where I was on a FEMA mission in Haiti. So early in 2010, a major earthquake struck one of the most impoverished countries in the Western Hemisphere, and that would be Haiti, killing 200,000 people and leaving 2.3 million homeless. And despite massive assistance from the United Nations and a number of countries, a lot of the refugees were living in temporary camps. They suffered from deadly outbreaks of cholera, and it was just really horrible. And then in the fall, Hurricane Thomas basically hit Haiti, creating more misery and deaths. And then in 2017, Hurricanes Harvey and Irma also hit that same location. So Haiti was devastated. And I remember when I was there, I was there 4 days after the earthquake. And there were still dead bodies all over the place, and people were still digging people out of rubble. And we were trying to provide medical attention, and it was extremely brutal. But there were people from everywhere, even the airport, all the buildings had crumbled, but they kept the airstrip open where they could still get help to come in and try to help them locate people and set up like little MASH unit hospitals, etc. So that's a catastrophe. So, again, an incident that directly or indirectly affects a large portion or all of a country and requires a national and sometimes an international response. And then finally, you have what we call an extinction event. And an extinction event could result or results in the loss of all human life on the planet. In the extreme, there is no effective emergency response, right, to an extinction event. So you have to kind of think about it. And although these types of, apocalyptic events have been, usually you see them, portrayed on TV, like you look at the Planet of the Apes or The Last Wave or Armageddon, Transformers, Independence Day, etc. Usually you see them on TV. The probability of a human extinction event is presently statistically slight. Nonetheless, it is still a possibility, right? So an extinction event is where the event could result or results in the loss of human life. What about like a big meteor strike that just hit right in the center of Earth and could destroy the entire planet? Now, sure, it's more than likely not going to happen, but could it happen? So that's an extinction event. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about pre-planning, because remember, FEMA, although it does a lot of, responding after an event, there are a lot of pre-planning pieces or capabilities to FEMA. So strong pre-planning and developing as many core capabilities as possible to use in achieving missions can really enhance the pace of progress from a disaster or catastrophe to recovery. Now, the recovery process, and we'll talk more later about that, but that's kind of a sequence of interdependent and often concurrent activities that progressively moves a community towards its planned recovery outcome. Now, the smart way to deal with risks really is to understand their consequences and pre-plan, right, to prevent them from happening and mitigating those that do occur. So it would be like if you lived in the flood zone and it floods every once in a while. You have to pre-plan for that. If you live in a fire area, let's say the mountains, there are pre-planned things that you have to do living in the mountains, right? Because of hazards, fires, etc. So it does help to, basically, plan to prevent them from happening and also mitigating those that are going to occur. Now, FEMA's Threat and Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment, or THURA, if you want to use an acronym, helps communities identify capability targets and resource requirements necessary to address anticipated and unanticipated risks. And you can find a little chart that shows you the steps on page 362 in your textbook. But the 4 steps are as follows. The first one would be identifying the threat and the hazard, right? That kind of makes sense. So based on a combination of things like experience or forecasting or subject matter expertise and other available resources, figure out or identify a list of threats and hazards of a primary concern to the area that you are in. Okay, that makes sense. Number 2, give the threats and hazards context. So describe the threats and hazards of concern, showing how they're going to affect or how they may affect your community. Number 3, establish capability targets. So FEMA has established a list of 32 core capabilities that communities doing risk planning should try to develop. And I believe it's on page 363 under figure 13, chart 13.8. It shows you some of those different prevention, protection, mitigation, response, recovery. It's got all that information for you. Anyway, a capability target identifies the core capability the community will need to try to develop. And core capabilities are, we'll talk about them a little bit further on as well. And then finally, number 4, apply the results. So for each core capability, estimate the resources required to achieve the capability targets with the use of community assets or even mutual aid agreement, right, help, while also considering preparedness, including mitigation opportunities. And it kind of seems like a lot, right? But again, it's important that we understand these pre-planning capabilities. So again, this is the threat and hazard identification and risk assessment. And here are actually the 4 steps. So when you look at them. So again, step 1, well, we've already gone through them, but step 1 is identify the threat. 2 is give the threat's context. 3, establish capability targets. And then 4, apply the results. Now, utilizing information gained through the use of what we just did, through this thorough model, okay, and other sources of data about your jurisdiction, communities plan for 5 different missions. So they go through this process and they get all the information listed at the bottom. They get they list the threats, hazards, they put some context, okay? They talk about, capability targets, and then they talk about resources. And through the steps, they're going to plan these 5 different missions, or plan 4. And that's going to include prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. So prevention is just what it means: prevent, avoid, or stop an imminent, something happening. So here it talks, again, under prevention, it talks about intelligence, information, and sharing, disruption, screening, etc. Protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. And each one falls into these categories. Now, you don't need to know everything in the category. You just need to know that this is how the process kind of works. So this is the thorough model, THIRA. So remember what it stands for, right? We can go back. Threat and hazard identification and risk assessment. This is the model. And based on all the information you get here, you're going to apply it to take the data, and you're going to plan for these 5 different missions. Okay, so now we're going to talk about recovery, because we've talked about, the actual incidents themselves. We've categorized the different levels, if you will. We talked about an emergency. We talked about a disaster. We talked about a catastrophe. We talked about an extinction event, and then we also talked about some pre-planning using the 2 formulas. But now we're going to talk about recovery. So in our drive to anticipate, plan, and develop other formal elements, we often lose sight of a major asset we neither plan for nor develop, but which is an important part of things from search and rescue all the way to recovery. And we're going to talk about a couple of different things as it relates to the recovery continuum. So I put in kind of a picture of this, and I believe they have that photo, this same graph, on page 364 of your textbook. But again, here's the preparedness portion. Here's your disaster. Okay, and here's your national response framework. And then you have the short term, the intermediate, the long term, and then we're going to have this, kind of recovery as we start to go in. So when disaster disrupts our everyday routine, things become chaotic, right? We are in a state of non-equilibrium. We're kind of out of balance. And many homes, are badly damaged or worse. and we are fearful of what might happen next, and the delivery of social services is also disrupted. Getting to medical services may not be possible. And sometimes wild and dangerous animals might even be nearby. And there's too much speculation and really not enough reliable information. And the problems facing us are complex and seem insurmountable. So in a disaster, FEMA and Homeland Security and local agencies really can't do everything that needs to be done, right? And what I'm kind of talking about, all those things that I talked about, kind of encompass something that's called chaos theory, where there's so much kind of going around that you're just all stressed out, and you're trying to figure out what to do. However, this chaos theory does not just explain how things spin out of control. Its real value is really how order is restored when we are basically kind of teetering at the top of a slippery slope. So, understand that from these accumulated experiences, new community alliances, priorities, and services emerge. And chaos theory explains not only how we the people self-organize, it also teaches us about how we reorganize our lives and move forward towards recovery. So when we talk about that recovery continuum, remember that, a lot of times when we're moving, when we're anticipating, our plan and developing all these other things, we lose sight of that plan to kind of recover. And part of that is because of what we call, the chaos theory. And it's when all those things are chaotic, and how I kind of explained it there. And also to kind of keep in mind, I did mention something. In a disaster, FEMA and Homeland Security and even local agencies really can't do everything that needs to be done. So a lot of times you're going to need to do things on your own, maybe even for a couple of days. So locally, and it's not in any of the slides, a lot of your local fire departments have what is called a CERT team, C-E-R-T. And basically, you can take these CERT classes as a citizen, a civilian, and kind of learn how to turn the gas off in your house at the meter outside. Make sure that you're storing enough supplies to be self-reliant until people can get to you. Because in a major disaster, let's say a huge 8.0 earthquake, roads might be crumpled up, and water mains might be broken, and gas might be leaking, and there might be fires, etc. You may not get emergency medical help right away. So, and this kind of this thought goes all the way back to the evolution of emergency management. So remember the CERT thing, and I know that was a little off track, but it's really important that you know that. And if you need any help on getting a contact, I can help you. But kind of looking at the evolution of emergency management, old colonial beliefs, to be, in that colonial area, there was kind of an ingrained belief that people should be self-reliant and responsible for themselves. And after a natural disaster, you have to have that attitude. Now, still, you're going to go help others, but you need to help yourself first. Now, for more catastrophic events, people did help each other. If a barn burned down, neighbors pitched in to raise and build a new one. When crop fields were washed away, others shared their food, etc. And to some degree, that tradition also later translated to towns and cities. For example, volunteers serving as firefighters. A lot of cities have these volunteer groups. But these old colonial beliefs, that started off kind of self-reliance, they've kind of transitioned into what we call mutual aid societies as cities got bigger. And we just talked about mutual aid. So as cities grew, private mutual aid societies or even other city components would provide assistance to their own when disasters struck. And these societies were often based on the country of origin, religion, or ethnicity, and their other purposes included helping immigrants make the transition to living in America and preserving their cultural heritage. Now remember, we're on the evolution of emergency management, okay? So we're kind of starting way back when, and we're starting to come forward. And as the United States developed economically, insurance became more available, but many people either didn't know about it really, or honestly, they really couldn't afford it. So, you had these old colonial beliefs at the beginning here that talked a lot about self-reliant, and then it grew into these little like neighborhoods or societies, these private groups that would come help, as cities started to grow. And initially they were, they helped in a lot of different things, but they were based on immigrants helping other immigrants of the same origin. And then, again, later, as I said, the U.S. started to, develop economically, and then insurance came around, but people either didn't know about it or honestly, they couldn't afford it. Now, founded in 1881, the American Red Cross has provided domestic and international relief, although there was often not much to distribute. In the 1900s, the American Red Cross was given the Congressional Charter, giving it legal status of a federal instrumentality. The charter recognized the exceptional work of the Red Cross and basically tasked it to continue its relief work. Now, no other similar American organization has ever attained this type of recognition. And you've heard of the American Red Cross today, I'm sure, right? So now we're kind of moving towards World War I to, let's say, the 1930s. So during World War I, which if you remember, that was about what, 1914 to 1918, right around in there. The Germans bombed, the English cities, anticipating America's entry into the war. The Council of National Defense was formed in about 1916. And the national defense focused on coordinating war resources such as manpower and maintaining high morale among civilian populations, etc. From a national perspective, emergency management ultimately grew out of World War I's most modest efforts in civil defense. As civil defense evolved, it ultimately took on a few emergency management type tasks. However, civil defense, had a dual use character for most of its existence. Initially, it was part of the national security effort, and then much later it began responding to national disasters. So again, emergency management it started to grow out of World War I, and the Great Depression and a severe drought furthered a need for, assistance, specifically federal assistance. Now, in response to the Great Depression and the severe drought, President Roosevelt produced 15 kind of new programs. They called them New Deal programs, but we'll just call them new programs, which mostly focused on employment. And, again, if you want to look at it economically, the two events that we talked about that shaped the 1930s, number one was the crash of the stock market in 1929, which actually produced a loss of about $75 billion and ushered in the Great Depression and the effects of, which lasted until roughly 1940 when the economy, kind of turned upward. And number two was the drought, again, that was so severe that it drove many farmers off of their land in the heartland area of the United States. So again, in response to these two things, these 15 programs, if you will, were brought forth. Now, we're still kind of, in World War I to the 30s. Now, the Federal Emergency Relief Act of 1933 provided assistance for the unemployed, and illustratively, the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1933 was a kind of a public works program that basically employed or enrolled millions of unmarried men and kind of got things going, if you will. So a little bit more about the impact here of World War II. Okay, so again, we're kind of going back. We're World War I. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the impact here. So Pearl Harbor propelled the United States into World War II and raised fear of attacks on the mainland. And in 1941, the Office of Civilian Defense coordinated federal, state, and local defense programs for the protection of civilians. So you can kind of see how things are starting to kind of just morph, right, throughout the years. And then we talk a little bit about the 50s and the 60s. So the Korean War gave way to the public's thoughts on potential nuclear wars. And in 1950, the Federal Civil Defense Administration, the FCDA, was created. And this created a nationwide system of civil defense agencies. So again, we're in the 50s and the 60s. And in 1950, the Disaster Relief Act gave the president authority to issue a disaster declaration and authorized federal agencies to provide limited direct assistance. So again, you can kind of see how things are continuing to move forward. Now, in 1961, President Kennedy divided the Office of Civil Defense and Mobilization and formed the Office of Emergency Preparedness, OEP. Now, every once in a while, have you ever, been watching TV or you can even hear it on the radio and somebody will come on and say, this is a message of the emergency broadcast system, and they play that annoying freaking noise that makes you want to stab your eyes out, and it lasts for like 30 seconds, and then it kind of beeps sometimes. That's where this came from, that, if you will. So in 1958, the FCDA was merged with the Office of Mobilization again, which had the responsibility for planning, coordinating, and controlling the mobilization of federal wartime assets. And this new organization was placed in the executive office of the president as the Office of Civil Defense Mobilization. And as we talk more about, issues not just relating to civil defense, but to disasters or catastrophes, we always think about this word prepper. And I'm not really a prepper. My wife tends to be a little bit more than I am. Do we have water and toilet paper and canned goods and things like that in our pantry and in the garage? Yes, but we don't have what these individuals have in the photos. But a prepper is and I think there's even a TV program called Preppers, right? Or there used to be. But anyway, this is a term, kind of a slang word, to describe those persons who are preparing for a major kind of apocalyptic event in the future. Now, when you say that, And again, I used to kind of laugh at my wife, but when we first started dealing with all the COVID stuff, when everybody, when you go to the store and you couldn't find, macaroni and cheese, tomato sauce, spaghetti, you couldn't find Clorox wipes or even toilet paper, I wasn't laughing as much because we had a lot of that in our house. So I don't really laugh at her anymore, but that's just to kind of give you, a break from the monotony in the lecture. That's a prepper. Okay, so now you kind of know what it is. Okay, so now let's move into the 70s. So again, we're still on this whole evolution of emergency management, right? And it's kind of cool to learn how this all came about. So we're going to talk about the 1970s and the emergence of FEMA. So the Disaster Relief Act of 1970, this was the first major attempt by the federal government to emphasize hazard mitigation as a priority in order to reduce the impact of future disasters. And by 1975, nearly 100 federal agencies had some aspect of disaster assistance. And this fragmentation basically led President Carter to create FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And I believe we talked a little bit about the creation of these agencies in previous chapters, but now you can see how it fits into the kind of the timeline. Now, only, when we talk about in the 1980s now to present, FEMA in the 1980s had to respond to 3 hurricanes. The residential relocating of families from the Love Canal poisoning and the eruption of Mount St. Helens. And so that was, kind of a lot to deal with, right? When you're talking about having to move all of these individuals and do all this stuff. So again, and I'll kind of read through it so that way maybe it makes a little bit more sense. But what this did is it created the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act of 1987. And this basically allowed now FEMA to help those that were basically homeless in a sense that they were displaced, right? So hopefully that kind of makes sense a little bit. In 1933, FEMA, or 1993, I'm sorry, FEMA reemerged with significant reforms and basically redirected civil defense resources. In 1995, the Oklahoma City bombing and the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996 required the Department of Justice and FEMA to begin to train firefighters about weapons of mass destruction. And so first responders then were also trained about weapons of mass destruction because, again, following the 1995 bombing in Oklahoma City, we started to understand the issues relating to weapons of mass destruction, and those are by definition weapons designed to cause significant devastation to a population, and it can also, or it does involve the release of different types of agents or gases, etc. And we'll talk about those in just a minute. So, in 2003, FEMA moved over, like other agencies. They moved over under the umbrella of the Department of Homeland Security. And then in 2005, FEMA also received really harsh criticism for the response to Hurricane Katrina. Because there were just, a lot of issues relating to FEMA and what they were doing. So the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act of 2006 basically did a couple of things. Here it talks about FEMA remained a standalone agency under DHS. FEMA was given control over more emergency response resources. And then FEMA's top official became the principal advisor on all emergencies, regardless of what the cause was. So again, kind of talking about weapons of mass destruction, etc. Following the 1995 bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City, President Clinton issued Presidential Directive 39. And this basically required that all federal government units to take actions to reduce vulnerabilities to terrorism, both at home and abroad. And it also talks about terrorists and their sponsors to be dealt with vigorously, and their actions would not alter American policies. So we know, as I said a few minutes ago, FEMA is responsible for developing federal and state response plans associated with terrorist attacks, especially with those utilizing weapons of mass destruction. Well, what really are those? So we're going to take a look at those. So the Center for Domestic Preparedness, the CDP, basically is a federal chartered center responsible for training state and local agencies on these WMDs, and all hazard training often addresses real world scenarios. So they actually have a training center that has things where you can go in and do real life scenarios. Now the acronym CBRNE kind of became the standard to describe these different types of attacks or weapons of mass destruction. So it would be chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive. So that's the term. They use it. They say it quickly. You might hear it said as CBRN, but it's also CBRNE. Remember, hazmat by definition is an acronym for hazardous and dangerous materials. Remember, an acronym, or PPE is an acronym for personal protection equipment. So again, these are all terms that are important for you to know. So along with FEMA, several other agencies have a primary or a supporting role in this type of CBRN attack, if you will. So the Department of Defense, the Army, and the National Guard are also examples, or some examples, of other agencies that assist in these types of things. So along with that, the CDC responds to CBRN attacks as well, and prepares first responders and community leaders for these types of hazards. They aid in developing cleanup protocols and mitigation after an incident. And then there's another word that's important for you to know by definition, and that would be the phrase pandemic. And by definition, this is an epidemic of an infectious disease that evolves in a large area. SARS, Ebola, and the flu are some, but also now we can add in COVID-19, right? Because that is basically, an epidemic. So, although, just a little bit more history, although not at the same, kind of lethality level, we've already witnessed pandemics, an epidemic of an infectious disease that, in a large area we talked about, right? We've seen this in modern history. The SARS pandemic in 2003, and the H1N1 flu pandemic, if you remember, in 2009, it spread globally within a few weeks, just like COVID, right? And the CDC was instrumental in tracking down the source of the outbreaks and the development of different, remedial therapies and vaccines that were used to combat the disease. And more distantly, the flu pandemic, and this was back in like 1918, killed about 675,000 people, and about 20 to 50 million people worldwide. So that's kind of the definition of a pandemic. Now, although the likelihood of a terrorist using a biologic agent is relatively remote because the germ would have to actually be weaponized, meaning that it would have to be highly refined and concentrated and developed under a very precise and consistent environmental conditions and then released over a period of time. While it doesn't seem likely, it really is possible, right? I mean, it really could happen. Now, more likely, any future pandemic would involve accidental human exposure to, a bunch of different diseases shared with animals. So, for instance, SARS, HIV, Ebola, and various strains of influenza or the flu are just a few of the many diseases that humans share with animals. But now, again, we have COVID-19, we have the coronavirus. So we can actually add that one to the list, unfortunately. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the National Incident Management System. Or I'm wondering if maybe we should take a quick break. All right, so let's do this. We have just a little bit more to go, but let's take a break, and we'll call this part 1 of chapter 13, and then we'll come back in a few minutes for part 2.